Good afternoon, everybody. My name is John Porter, and today we're going to be analyzing geopolitical shifts in Eastern Europe um, following the collapse of the Soviet Union in the post-Cold War era. We'll be specifically looking at Russian troop deployments in that time frame. We'll be focusing on two separate theories, and the first is defensive realism, which says that states are primarily driven by insecurity and the need for survival within an anarchic international system, and we're going to analyze how Russian troop deployments might be in response to perceived threats or strategic challenges by NATO or potentially a neighboring state or even the United States. And then, contrarily, we're going to look at offensive realism, which says that states are inherently aggressive and seek to maximize power and expand their geopolitical footprints to ensure their survival. And we're going to consider whether Russian troop deployments could be efforts to reclaim historical territories once controlled by the USSR, expand their influence, assert their dominance, particularly in areas like Crimea and eastern Ukraine. My research question for my thesis is what theory best explains Russian military deployments in Eastern Europe following the Cold War? My hypothesis is that defensive realism is the best explanation for Russia's military deployments in response to perceived security threats. However, offensive realism also plays a role under certain conditions, influencing Russia to undertake assertive actions in some cases. The I've developed a coding schema to analyze my case studies and analyze the motivations behind Russian troop deployments. And I've separated my coding schema into 5 key categories, each designed to assess Russian different aspects of military behavior by Russia, helping us determine whether actions are defensive or offensively motivated. And the way the scheme is set up is works from -10 all the way across 0 to +10. And a -10 would indicate a highly defensive response aligning with defensive realism. A 0 would indicate both offensive and defensive motivations. And then a +10 or a +10 score would indicate highly offensive motivations aligning with offensive realism. And in this coding schema, I've separated it into 5 categories, as I said. And the first is verbal provocations. What I'm looking for here is to determine whether or not verbal provocations were present. And if they were, if Russia received verbal threats from an exterior neighboring state or potentially NATO or the United States, and as a result of those threats deployed troops, that's going to result in a negative score. And contrarily, if there were no verbal provocations and Russia deployed troops, that's going to generate a positive score. And then when we look at category 2, we're looking at military provocations. And in the event that there were, say, troop movements or joint exercises between a neighboring state and, say, NATO or the United States, or potentially the United States or NATO are training militaries that belong to a neighboring state, and Russia deployed troops in the event that those military provocations happened, that's going to generate a negative score. And in the absence of those acts, it's going to generate a positive score. When we look at category 3, diplomatic efforts, what we're looking for is to see that in the event either of those 2 provocations happened, if Russia deployed troops without the effort at diplomacy to resolve those threats, and then if they deployed troops and attempted diplomacy to resolve those threats, then that's going to generate a negative score. And in the event that they deploy troops without attempting to solve those security concerns with diplomacy, that's going to generate a positive score. And then when we look at our 4th category of military institutions, what we're looking for is to see if in the event or when Russia either achieved or did not achieve their military objective, if they removed their troops and did not seize control of the military institutions in that area in which they deployed troops, that's going to generate a negative score. And in the event that they seize control of those military institutions, once the fighting ended, that's going to generate a positive score. And similarly with category 5 and political institutions, what we're looking for is to see if Russia seized control of the government in the area in which it deployed troops. And in the event that they did not, they removed their troops once the fighting ended, that's going to generate a negative score. And then contrarily, in the event that they seize control of the government in that area, that's going to generate a positive score. And in my analysis, I've examined 6 different case studies, as I said, and applied a coding schema to investigate the reasons behind Russian troop movements. I've classified these motivations as either defensive, offensive, or potentially a mixture of both. And this approach has helped me gain a clearer picture of what drives Russian military strategies. These case studies give us a full view of how Russian troops have been deployed from the moment the Soviet Union fell to the present time, and we'll see how both defensive and offensive strategies have shaped their military decisions in that time frame. I've got 6 case studies that I used for my thesis. The first is the 1991 Georgian Civil War, followed by the 1994 conflict in Chechnya, the 1999 Second Chechen War, and followed by the 2008 Georgian conflict in South Ossetia and Abkhazia, and then the 2014 annexation of Crimea, followed by the most current, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I've generated this illustration to just kind of give an idea of what Russia's perspective might be as far as NATO expansion and why it could potentially be perceived as a threat. And what I've got here in green illustrates the states that belong to NATO prior to the collapse of the USSR. And then what we see in pink is any states that have joined NATO since that time frame. So post collapse of the USSR, when the USSR fell. So you can see how NATO expansion is moving closer to Russia, with the exception of Ukraine, Belarus, and Georgia. It is almost up against Russia's entire western border. And I've created this next illustration just to kind of give a perspective of what it would look like if Ukraine and Georgia were to join NATO. You see here, Ukraine and Georgia are shown in pink. They're not actual NATO members. This is just for an illustration. But in the event that they were to join NATO, you can see that now Russia is completely encapsulated on its western border by an adversary, a military adversary, which is NATO. And to my mind, Russia should perceive that as a threat, and that is the way that is the way I looked at it as I went through my analysis of these 6 separate case studies. Of the 6 case studies, 4 of them garnered defensive or negative scores. The first is the 1991 Georgian Civil War, which received a score of -4, followed by the 1994 conflict in Chechnya, received a -1. Then the 2008 Georgian conflict in South Ossetia and Abkhazia, that received a highly defensive score of -34. And then lastly, we see the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine, which currently has a highly negative score of 24. But we have to remember that this conflict is not ended, so we don't know, with regard to our 5th and 6th categories, if Russia is going to remove their troops or if they're going to seize control of the Ukraine government and the Ukraine military. And in the event that they do seize either one of those, that score will then come down closer to 0, potentially -4 in the event that they seize control, say, the Donbass area going down into Crimea. If they seize that area, that score is going to come down to closer to a -4. And then if they don't, in the event that they just remove their troops, that score is going to get even more defensive, say to 34 or 35, somewhere in that area. And in these last 2 case studies, they both received a score of 0, indicating a balanced approach of both negative and defensive motivations by Russia. They were just balanced. And by analyzing these case studies and applying my coding schema, I've uncovered a nuanced interplay of defensive and offensive motivations behind Russian military deployments in Eastern Europe. This examination reveals that Russian behavior stems from both insecurity and expansionist goals when making their geopolitical decisions in that area. My analysis of Russian military deployments, guided by the theories of defensive and offensive realism, has shed light on the varied motivations behind these strategies. From security-driven defensive actions to assertive offensive maneuvers, each strategy is in response to the complex geopolitical environment we've seen in the post-Cold War. And understanding these complex dynamics is crucial for predicting and responding to Russian future military actions. As geopolitical tensions evolve, especially in Eastern Europe, this insight will be essential in shaping informed policy and diplomatic strategies. And we must stay vigilant and adaptable to the changing international landscape. Remember, Russia has the largest nuclear arsenal in the world, even more so than the United States. Thank you for your attention and your engagement today. I appreciate the opportunity to share these findings with you, and I hope you enjoyed them.